Dr. Ethan Chase adjusted his silk tie in the Hopkins parking garage mirror, checking his reflection one final time before the cameras arrived. At 42, he'd mastered the art of looking approachable yet authoritative, the kind of face that made patients trust him with their hearts and made network executives trust him with primetime ratings. His show, Heart Matters with Dr. Chase, had turned a brilliant cardiac surgeon into America's favorite medical celebrity, complete with book deals, speaking tours, and a penthouse overlooking Baltimore's Inner Harbor. Today's shoot would feature Senator Richard Crawford's pre-surgical consultation, the kind of high-profile case that guaranteed headlines and boosted both his reputation and his bottom line. As he walked toward the hospital entrance, surrounded by a production crew, Ethan felt a familiar rush of performing medicine in front of millions, saving lives while building an empire, exactly as he'd always dreamed. The pediatric ward's fluorescent lights flickered as Lucia Reyes finished her double shift, her navy scrubs wrinkled from 16 hours of rushing between patient rooms. She'd been in America for 3 years now, working nights at Johns Hopkins to send money home to Manila while studying for her U.S. medical licensing exams during stolen moments in the break room. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "You are the best cardiologist in Manila, Anik, but here you must start again." At 36, Lucia had traded her white coat for scrubs, her own clinic for someone else's orders, her medical authority for the invisible exhaustion of being perpetually underestimated. The wound still stung, but she'd learned to carry her past quietly. A Harvard fellowship refused due to visa issues, a who position abandoned to care for her dying father, credentials that meant nothing in this new country that promised everything. Amber Sterling, Ethan's girlfriend and executive producer, surveyed the cardiology wing with her tablet raised like a weapon, already imagining the dramatic B-roll shots. She'd turned Heart Matters from a modest medical education show into a reality drama hybrid, where complicated surgeries became emotional narratives complete with cliffhangers and carefully edited conflicts. Today's Senator case was perfect: powerful patient, complex surgery, career-making stakes, and she'd already planned the episode title, Hearts of Power. Her diamond bracelet caught the morning light as she directed cameramen into position, reminding everyone that great television required great risks. What the hospital administrators didn't know, what even Ethan didn't fully understand, was that Amber occasionally rearranged facts to heighten drama, convinced that inspiring medicine justified creative truth-telling. Hello, my friends. Before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. The production crew transformed the consultation room into a makeshift studio, lighting rigs casting dramatic shadows across the medical charts as Senator Crawford settled into the patient chair. Ethan reviewed the senator's file with practiced confidence, his voice already adopting the warm authority that had made him famous, a perfect blend of concern and competence that played beautifully on camera. The diagnosis seemed straightforward: severe coronary artery disease requiring immediate bypass surgery, a procedure Ethan had performed hundreds of times with a success rate that bordered on miraculous. Amber hovered just outside the camera frame, nodding approvingly as Ethan explained the risks with just enough gravity to make viewers appreciate the stakes without causing alarm. The senator signed consent forms while the cameras captured every moment, medical drama intersecting with political power in exactly the way that guaranteed viral clips and Emmy nominations. Lucia passed the consultation room, carrying fresh linens, catching fragments of the conversation to the half-open door, despite trying to focus on her work. Something about the senator's file troubled her. She glimpsed his labs during morning rounds and noticed unusual inflammatory markers that didn't quite match a typical cardiac profile. Years of working in tropical medicine had taught her to recognize patterns that others might dismiss, subtle signals that indicated something lurking beneath the obvious diagnosis. But she was just a nurse now, and nurses didn't question celebrity doctors on camera, especially not immigrant nurses whose accents still marked them as outsiders despite perfect English and years of medical training. She continued down the hallway with her linens, filing away her concerns while knowing that speaking up could cost her the job she desperately needed to keep sending money home to her mother and younger siblings in Manila. Later that afternoon, Lucia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Senator Crawford's case as she reviewed his chart during her break. The eosinophil counts were elevated in a pattern she'd seen before during her work. Not cardiac disease, but parasitic infection. Specifically a tropical parasite that could mimic heart symptoms while slowly damaging organs. She'd spent 2 years running a clinic near Mindanao treating exactly these kind of cases, watching patients present with heart attacks that were actually schistosomiasis or strongyloidiasis, requiring completely different treatment protocols. If Senator Crawford had traveled to Southeast Asia recently, which seemed likely for a senator on the Foreign Relations Committee, he might have contracted something that would make surgery not just unnecessary, but potentially fatal. Lucia's hands trembled as she photocopied the relevant pages from a tropical medicine journal she kept in her locker, evidence she might need if anyone would listen to a nurse questioning a celebrity surgeon's diagnosis before millions of viewers and a $400,000 surgery. The cafeteria hummed with the usual dinner rush when Lucia finally found Ethan alone, reviewing surgical plans on his tablet between bites of what looked like takeout sushi. She approached his table nervously, the journal pages folded in her pocket, trying to find words that wouldn't sound like insubordination or worse, presumption from someone who was supposed to simply follow orders and keep her medical opinions to herself. Dr. Chase, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I've been reviewing Senator Crawford's labs, and I'm concerned about his eosinophil levels and travel history, she began, her accent thickening with nervousness. Ethan looked up with barely concealed annoyance, taking in her rumpled scrubs and the ID badge that identified her simply as L. Reyes Arden, without any credentials she'd earned across an ocean. Nurses observe, doctors diagnose, he said coolly, returning to his tablet as if the conversation was already over, and she'd been sufficiently dismissed with the kind of casual cruelty that only the powerful can deliver. Lucia felt heat rise to her face, humiliation mixed with anger being treated like she'd overstepped rather than potentially saved a life. With respect, Doctor, I've seen this presentation before, and if you just look at the travel, she started, but Ethan cut her off a look that could freeze blood. If you've seen this before, then you'd know I performed over 2,000 cardiac surgeries with a mortality rate of less than 1%, he said, his voice loud enough that other doctors at nearby tables turned to watch. Senator Crawford's case is straightforward coronary disease. We've run every standard test, and the surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning with full hospital approval and media coverage. Amber appeared beside him as if summoned, placing a proprietary hand on his shoulder, while giving Lucia the kind of smile that powerful women give to those they consider beneath notice or threat. I'm sure Nurse Reyes is just being thorough, Amber said sweetly, her tone dripping with condescension, but maybe you should trust the expert here. Lucia nodded stiffly and walked away, her warning rejected and her professional opinion reduced to the meddling of an anxious nurse who didn't know her place in a carefully constructed hierarchy of American medicine. That night, Lucia lay awake in her shared apartment in Baltimore's Filipino community, staring at the ceiling while her roommate's breathing provided the only sound besides distant traffic. She thought about Senator Crawford waking up tomorrow, being wheeled into surgery, having his chest open for a procedure he didn't need, while the real disease progressed unchecked in his bloodstream. Medical ethics warred with practical survival. If she pushed harder and was wrong, she'd lose her job and maybe her work visa, destroying everything she'd sacrificed to build in America. But if she stayed silent and was right, a man would die while she stood by with knowledge that could have saved him, becoming complicit in exactly the kind of medical arrogance she'd fought against her entire career. Her old mentor in Manila used to say, medicine is not about hierarchy, it's about truth. But that was before Lucia learned that in America, hierarchy often determined whose truth mattered and whose was dismissed as immigrant presumption. As dawn approached, Lucia made her decision. She would try one more time, and if they still didn't listen, she would do something that might cost her everything but would let her sleep at night. The pre-op area buzzed with controlled chaos as Senator Crawford was prepped for surgery, his vital signs stable and his spirits high despite the cameras documenting his every moment of courage. Ethan moved through the rituals with practiced ease, reviewing consent forms, explaining the procedure one final time, offering reassurances that felt genuine even as they served the dual purpose of good bedside manner and great television. Amber directed her crew to capture the senator's goodbye to his family, the kind of emotionally resonant footage that would anchor the episode's third act and drive social media engagement. The operating room stood ready 2 floors above, a team of specialists assembled for what should be a routine but career-defining surgery that would cement Ethan's reputation as the surgeon senators trusted with their lives. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, medical excellence meeting media spectacle, until a Filipino nurse burst through the corridor doors with desperation written across her face and a folder of papers clutched in her trembling hands. Lucia knew she had seconded before security removed her, so she spoke quickly and loudly, her voice carrying across the pre-op area as cameras swiveled in her direction. "Senator Crawford, has anyone asked you about recent travel to Southeast Asia, specifically to areas with endemic parasitic diseases that can present identical symptoms to coronary artery disease?" The room froze as if someone pulled a fire alarm. Ethan's face went from surprise to furious. Amber immediately signaled the cameras to keep rolling, and the senator's wife looked between Lucia and Ethan with growing confusion. "Dr. Chase has reviewed my complete history," the senator said carefully, his politician's instincts sensing conflict. But Lucia pressed on despite the security guard already moving toward her. "Your eosinophil count is elevated. Your C-reactive protein pattern doesn't match typical cardiac inflammation. And if you've been to the Philippines, Thailand, or any tropical region in the past 6 months, you might have a parasitic infection that surgery could kill you during." The folder of journal articles shook in her hands as she held them out like evidence at a trial, knowing she'd crossed a line for which there was no return, but unable to stop now that truth had found its voice. Ethan stepped between Lucia and the senator, his camera-ready warmth replaced by the cold fury of someone whose authority had been publicly challenged. "Security, remove this nurse from the pre-op area immediately," he ordered, then turned to Senator Crawford with an expression of calm professionalism designed to restore confidence. "Senator, I apologize for this disruption. Nurse Reyes means well, but is clearly overstepping her qualifications and causing unnecessary alarm." Lucia felt the security guard's hand on her arm, but refused to leave quietly, her voice rising with desperation as years of swallowed expertise finally erupted. "I'm not just a nurse. I was a cardiologist in Manila. I ran a clinic treating tropical diseases for 2 years. I've seen exactly this presentation kill 3 patients who had unnecessary surgery before the parasites were identified." The admission hung in the air like confession, revealing the secret she kept hidden beneath her scrubs, and for a moment even Ethan hesitated, his certainty flickering as he processed what she just claimed. "Then why are you working as a nurse?" Amber interjected with theatrical skepticism, sensing great television even as she defended her boyfriend and her narrative. Maybe because her credentials don't translate, or maybe because she was as good as she claims. Either way, this is medical drama, not medical advice. Senator Crawford raised his hand, stopping the security guard mid-escort, his political instincts recognizing that dismissing a whistleblower on camera, especially an immigrant woman making serious medical claims, would look terrible regardless of whether she was right. "Let her speak," he said quietly, and Lucia felt the guard's grip loosen as all eyes turned back to her with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. "I worked at Philippine General Hospital's cardiology department after medical school, then completed a fellowship in infectious cardiology through a research partnership with Harvard Medical School," she began, her voice steadier now that someone was actually listening. "I joined the WHO's tropical disease program in Mindanao, where we saw dozens of cases of cardiac mimicry, parasites that produce exactly the symptoms you have, Senator, including the chest pain, the abnormal stress test, even the slight changes on echocardiogram." She pulled out the copied journal articles, showing highlighted sections about schistosomiasis and strongyloidiasis, presenting as acute coronary syndrome, cases where surgery had been fatal because the real disease remained untreated. "I came to America when my father got sick, and by the time I could return to medicine, my credentials weren't recognized. I'd need to redo residency, which I can't afford while supporting my family, so I became a nurse to stay in medicine while I studied for the U.S. licensing exams." The vulnerability of that admission felt like stripping naked in front of strangers, but at least now they understood she wasn't some confused floor nurse playing doctor. Ethan's mind raced through the implications. If she was right, unnecessary surgery on a senator would end his career and possibly land him in jail for malpractice despite the best intentions. But if she was wrong, delaying surgery based on a nurse's intuition or a former doctor's theory, could kill Crawford if his coronary disease truly needed immediate intervention, and either way the medical board would investigate why he let a non-credentialed staff member override his diagnosis. Your concerns are noted, Nurse Reyes, but I've consulted with 3 other cardiologists who all confirmed the surgical plan, he said, trying to regain control of the situation even as doubt crept into his voice. Did any of them ask about tropical disease exposure? Lucia countered, her desperation making her bold. Did anyone run a blood smear for parasites, or test for strongyloides antibodies, or check his recent travel history specifically for endemic regions? The questions landed like punches because Ethan realized with sinking certainty that no one had. They'd seen classic cardiac symptoms, run cardiac tests, and arrive at the cardiac conclusion without considering exotic possibilities that brilliant diagnosticians might catch but hurried specialists might miss. Senator, I'm asking you directly, have you traveled to tropical regions in the past 6 months? And if so, did you wade in fresh water, eat undercooked meat, or have any exposure that might explain parasitic infection? Lucia addressed him directly now, bypassing Ethan's authority with the kind of doctor-to-patient rapport that transcended credentials. Senator Crawford's face paled as memory apparently surfaced, his wife gripping his hand, while cameras captured every second of this unscripted medical drama. I was in the Philippines 4 months ago for 4 relations meetings. We visited rural areas. I shook a lot of hands, ate local food to be respectful, he admitted slowly. There was a river ceremony where officials waded in as a symbolic gesture, and I joined them because refusing seemed insulting to our hosts. The room's energy shifted as that single detail transformed Lucia's theory from wild speculation to uncomfortable possibility, and even Amber stopped directing her crew to actually listen to what was unfolding. Did you have any illness after digestive issues, mild fever, fatigue that you attributed to jet lag? Lucia pressed, her clinical training taking over. All of the above, the senator confirmed, but my doctor said it was just travel exhaustion and maybe some minor food poisoning that cleared up on its own. Lucia turned to Ethan with barely contained urgency, her eyes meeting his with a kind professional intensity that transcended their earlier conflict. Dr. Chase, I'm begging you, before you open his chest, just run a strongyloides serology and a peripheral blood smear for eosinophils and parasites. It takes 30 minutes, and if I'm wrong, you can proceed as planned and I'll resign on the spot. The offer hung between them. Her entire American dream wagered against the possibility that she'd just saved a senator's life using knowledge earned in a clinic halfway around the world. The next 30 minutes felt like hours as the surgical team waited for lab results. Ethan paced in the corridor, while Lucia sat outside the pre-op area with security still hovering nearby in case she needed to be escorted out. Amber had stopped filming, sensing that the narrative had slipped beyond her control into something authentic and unpredictable, the kind of medical crisis that couldn't be stage-managed or edited into satisfying television. Senator Crawford remained in pre-op limbo, his surgery delayed but not canceled, while his wife researched strongyloidiasis on her phone with growing horror at the images and case studies. Ethan found himself standing beside Lucia in the hallway's fluorescent silence, the question he'd been avoiding finally emerging. Why didn't you just report your concerns through proper channels instead of this dramatic confrontation? She looked at him with exhaustion that had nothing to do with her double shift and everything to do with years of being invisible despite her expertise. I tried talking to you yesterday. You dismissed me, she said simply. And proper channels take days while your surgery was scheduled for this morning. So I had to choose between following protocol and saving a life. And I chose what my medical oath demanded, even if it cost me everything I built here. Her honesty cut through his defensiveness because Ethan realized she'd been willing to sacrifice her career for a patient who didn't even know her name, which was more than he could say about his own recent choices driven by cameras and celebrity. The lab technician appeared at the corridor's end, her expression grave as she approached with results that would either vindicate or destroy Lucia's credibility in the next 30 seconds. Dr. Chase, you need to see this, she said, handing over the tablet with the bloodwork analysis displayed in stark black and white. Ethan's face went through a series of micro-expressions as he read, confusion, disbelief, then slowly dawning horror as the numbers told their story. Positive for strongyloides stercoralis antibodies. Peripheral blood smear shows larvae consistent with hyperinfection syndrome. Eosinophil count off the charts, he read aloud. his voice stripped of its usual confidence. If we'd operated... He couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood the implications. Surgery would have triggered hyperinfection syndrome, the parasites multiplying uncontrollably throughout Crawford's body, likely killing him on the operating table or within days after. Lucia stood slowly, her legs shaky with relief and residual adrenaline, while Amber emerged from the observation room with her camera crew trailing behind, now capturing the moment when the immigrant nurse had been right and the celebrity surgeon catastrophically wrong. I need to notify the senator and start antiparasitic treatment immediately. Ivermectin and albendazole for at least 2 weeks before any surgical consideration, Lucia said professionally, already mentally reviewing the treatment protocol she'd used dozens of times in Mindanao. The media firestorm began before Senator Crawford even left the hospital, with Amber's footage leaked or deliberately released. Ethan was no longer sure, showing the dramatic confrontation and vindication. Celebrity surgeon nearly kills senator. Immigrant nurse saves the day, ran on every news site, accompanied by photos of Lucia looking exhausted and heroic beside text explaining her hidden medical credentials and the dangerous parasite Ethan had missed. His inbox exploded with interview requests, hospital administrators demanding meetings, and his agent calling frantically about the damage to his brand and whether the show could survive. Ethan found himself in an unfamiliar position. Publicly humiliated on the same platforms that had built his fame, forced to issue statements about additional oversight and expanded diagnostic protocols that were really just PR speak for I screwed up. The hospital's legal team went into crisis mode, anticipating a malpractice suit that could cost millions, while the senator's family lawyers started making calls that sounded more curious than hostile. Apparently, Crawford wanted to thank Lucia personally rather than sue anyone. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. The same cameras he courted for fame now broadcast his fallibility to millions, turning his greatest strength into his most painful weakness. Lucia became an overnight sensation against her will. Her face on television, her story trending on social media, reporters camping outside her Baltimore apartment trying to get interviews. The attention felt overwhelming after years of deliberate invisibility, and she ignored most requests while focusing on Senator Crawford's treatment plan and the complicated antiparasitic regimen that would eliminate the infection over several weeks. Her fellow nurses treated her differently now, some with admiration for standing up to a powerful doctor, others with resentment that she'd hidden her true qualifications while working alongside them as if she were their equal. "Why didn't you tell us you were a doctor?" asked Maria, her closest friend on the ward, and Lucia struggled to explain the shame of downward mobility, the way admitting her past made present humiliations more acute. Because being a doctor who works as a nurse feels worse than just being a nurse, she finally said, "At least this way I could pretend I'd chosen it rather than had it forced on me by systems that value American credentials over Asian experience." The confession hung between them in the break room, where Lucia had spent countless nights studying while pretending her medical degree, gathering dust in Manila, didn't represent everything she'd lost in translation. Senator Crawford's recovery became a second news cycle when he held a press conference thanking Nurse Lucia Reyes, who saved my life through expertise the system almost silenced. He announced he was sponsoring legislation to create expedited pathways for foreign medical graduates with proven experience, highlighting Lucia's case as an example of talent America was wasting through bureaucratic barriers and credential gatekeeping. This woman ran a WHO clinic, treated hundreds of patients, and had to start over as a nurse. Not because she lacked skill, but because her excellence happened in the wrong country, Crawford declared, his political charisma turning Lucia's personal story into policy advocacy. The media loved the narrative. Powerful senator nearly dies. Immigrant nurse with hidden credentials saves him. Systemic change proposed. It was a kind of redemptive arc that validated both meritocracy and multiculturalism simultaneously. Lucia watched the press conference from her apartment, feeling equal parts grateful and exposed, wondering what her new visibility would mean for the quiet life she'd built in Baltimore's Filipino community, where being unremarkable had felt like safety after years of professional disappointment. Ethan knew he needed to apologize, but pride and embarrassment kept him circling the idea without landing on action for 3 days after the incident. His show had been suspended pending investigation, his surgical schedule reduced to only essential procedures, and Amber had moved out of his penthouse with a terse text about needing space to think. The emptiness of his life without cameras and applause felt suffocating. For the first time in years, Ethan was forced to confront whether he'd build a career on actual excellence or just effective self-promotion and surgical luck. He found himself reviewing Lucia's file obsessively. Top of her class at University of the Philippines, published research on tropical cardiology, who commendations for her clinic's impact in underserved communities, credentials that would have earned her respect at any American institution if she'd had the right passport or the financial resources to navigate the record-credentialing maze. The contrast shamed him. She achieved more with fewer resources while he coasted on institutional privilege, and when she tried to share her knowledge, he dismissed her with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never had to fight to be heard. That realization, that he'd become exactly the kind of arrogant doctor he'd once despised as a medical student, felt worse than any newspaper headline calling him reckless or incompetent. The pediatric ward's small chapel provided the privacy Ethan needed when he finally found Lucia during her shift break, sitting in a pew of rosary and what looked like a letter from home. She looked up when he entered, her expression carefully neutral, not hostile, but not welcoming either. Just the professional courtesy of someone who'd learned to guard her emotions around powerful people who'd hurt her. "I owe you an apology," Ethan began, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "Not just for dismissing your concerns about Senator Crawford, but for how I treated you. Like your opinion didn't matter because you're a nurse, like your accent meant you didn't understand medicine, like your credentials earned anywhere but America couldn't possibly be legitimate." Lucia folded her rosary carefully, her silence making him continue when he might have stopped. "You were right about everything. The diagnosis, the danger, the arrogance that made me miss what you saw immediately," he continued, his voice rough with genuine remorse. "I've spent days wondering how many other people on my team have knowledge I've dismissed because they weren't doctors or didn't have the right pedigree or didn't fit my narrow idea of expertise." He wanted to explain about his own insecurities, his fear of being exposed as less brilliant than his reputation suggested. But those felt like excuses rather than explanations. "I'm sorry, Lucia, for putting my ego ahead of patient care, for treating you as less than the expert you clearly are, and for being exactly the kind of doctor I promised myself I'd never become." Lucia studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity against years of hollow apologies from men who said sorry but never changed. "Do you know what the worst part was?" she finally said, her voice soft but steady. "Not the public embarrassment or even risking the senator's life. It was a look on your face when you said, 'Nurses observe, doctors diagnose.' Like I should be grateful you didn't punish me just for speaking up." The words landed like a scalpel finding exactly the right spot. "In Manila, I trained residents, published papers, made decisions about life and death every day. And then I came here and became invisible, not because I forgot how to do medicine, but because your system values what you studied over what you know." She tucked the letter from home back into her pocket, and Ethan glimpsed familiar handwriting that suggested family, depending on her paychecks. "I don't need your apology to validate my expertise. Dr. Chase, I know what I'm capable of regardless of whether you acknowledge it," she continued. "But I appreciate that you came here to say it anyway, because it suggests maybe you learned something beyond just fear of malpractice lawsuits." Her forgiveness, qualified and earned rather than automatically granted, felt more valuable than any absolution he might have received from someone who needed to placate him. "What I really need is for you to treat the next immigrant nurse or technician or janitor with medical knowledge like they might see something you miss. Not because I was right once, but because expertise doesn't always wear credentials you expect." The conversation evolved from apology to unexpected connection as they sat in the chapel's quiet. Two people whose lives had collided dramatically, finding common ground beneath the crisis. Ethan asked about her training, genuinely curious now rather than defensive, and Lucia described Philippine General Hospital's brutal residency, where she'd learned to diagnose with minimal resources and maximal creativity. "We didn't have a MRI for every patient or panel test for tropical diseases. We had to really see people, really listen, use clinical skills that technology hasn't replaced," she explained. "That's why I caught Senator Crawford's presentation. I learned to trust the pattern recognition that comes from treating hundreds of cases without fancy equipment as a crutch." Ethan recognized his own deficits in her description, the way expensive technology had made him lazier about observation and history-taking. They talked about the VU clinic where Lucia had worked with people who couldn't afford treatment, medicine as calling rather than business, the satisfaction of diagnosis that saved rather than impressed. "Why did you leave?" he asked, and her answer revealed the weight she'd carried alone for years. "My father had a stroke. I came home to Manila to care for him, and by the time he died, my WHO position was filled and visa rules had changed." She said simply, "I could have fought to get back, but my mother needed support and my siblings needed school fees. So I came to America where nursing wages could support everyone even if it meant pretending my medical degree didn't exist." The sacrifice embedded in that choice, ambition subordinated to family, professional identity erased by practical necessity, made Ethan's own career choices look shallow by comparison. The hospital's administrator, Dr. Patricia Green, called both Lucia and Ethan into her office a week after the senator incident, her expression unreadable as she gestured them to chairs. The meeting could go either direction, vindication or termination, celebration or crisis, and Lucia felt her heart race with a familiar fear of bureaucratic judgment that had defined her American experience. "I've reviewed the full incident, consulted with legal, and spoken with Senator Crawford's office," Dr. Green began, her corporate tone revealing nothing about her conclusions. "Nurse Reyes, you violated protocol by confronting a physician in front of cameras and a patient without going through proper channels. That alone could justify termination." Lucia's stomach dropped even as Dr. Green continued. "However, your medical judgment was not only correct, but likely prevented a death and a catastrophic malpractice case that would have cost this hospital hundreds of millions in damages and reputation." The qualifier shifted the room's energy, and Lucia saw Ethan exhale slightly beside her. "Dr. Chase, your dismissal of legitimate medical concerns from qualified staff, regardless of their current position, represents exactly the kind of hierarchical arrogance we're trying to eliminate from modern medicine," Dr. Green said, her words as sharp as they were fair. "That said, your willingness to delay surgery when presented with evidence and your public acknowledgement of error shows the kind of integrity we want to cultivate rather than punish." She paused, letting them both sit with their respective failures and recoveries before delivering her verdict. "Here's what's going to happen," Dr. Green continued, pulling out a folder that suggested she'd already made decisions rather than soliciting input. "Lucia, I've contacted the American Medical Association's Foreign Graduate Office and several medical schools about your case. Senator Crawford's legislation may take years, but we can expedite things through existing channels if we have institutional backing." Lucia's breath caught, hardly daring to hope after years of closed doors and bureaucratic runarounds. "Johns Hopkins is prepared to offer you a position as a clinical fellow in cardiology, which will allow you to practice medicine under supervision while you complete whatever licensing requirements remain," Dr. Green explained. "It's not a full doctor position yet, but it's not a nursing position either. It's recognition that you have expertise we've been wasting because of credential technicalities." The offer felt surreal after 3 years of invisible double shifts, like someone had finally translated her worth into institutional language that mattered. "We'll cover your licensing exam fees, provide study time within your work schedule, and fast-track your credentialing process with whatever political capital Senator Crawford's interest provides," Dr. Green added. "In return, you'll help us develop protocols for recognizing foreign medical training. Teach our residents about tropical diseases they'll miss without global perspective, and serve as a consultant on cases where your specific expertise might prevent another near miss like Senator Crawford's." The position was everything Lucia had stopped letting herself want, dressed in the practical terms of benefit to the institution rather than charity toward her. Ethan watched Lucia's face transform as Dr. Green outlined her new position. Professional dignity restored, expertise finally acknowledged, her American dream resuscitated through a crisis that could have destroyed it. "Dr. Chase, your show will remain suspended, but we're not terminating your surgical privileges," Dr. Green said, pulling his attention back to his own professional fate. "Instead, you'll be leading a new initiative called Diagnostic Humility, a training program for physicians about recognizing expertise regardless of hierarchy, listening to all staff observations, and avoiding the kind of cognitive biases that almost killed Senator Crawford." The assignment felt like penance disguised as leadership, but Ethan recognized its wisdom even as his ego chafed against it. You'll work directly with Lucia on developing this program, drawing on her experience of being dismissed despite her qualifications. Dr. Green continued. Consider it both professional development and restitution, teaching others the lessons you learned the hard way. Amber's show had made medicine about drama, but this new mandate required something deeper: vulnerability about mistakes, curiosity about knowledge he didn't possess, genuine collaboration across hierarchies that he'd taken for granted. If you can demonstrate real change over the next 6 months, we'll consider reinstating your show with a new focus: less celebrity surgeon, more educational partnership. But only if you prove you've learned something beyond just avoiding malpractice lawsuits, Dr. Green said. Her conditions were fair but stringent, recognizing that reputation rebuilding required substance rather than spin. The meeting concluded with handshakes that felt like tentative new beginnings, and Lucia and Ethan found themselves in the hallway together, processing the unexpected turn their professional lives had taken. A clinical fellowship, Lucia said softly, as if speaking the words aloud might make them disappear. I can practice medicine again, even if it's supervised, even if I still need to pass exams. I get to be a doctor in America, not just remember being one in Manila. The joy in her voice was tempered by caution, years of disappointment teaching her not to celebrate prematurely, but hope crept through anyway. Ethan felt simultaneously happy for her and ashamed that it had taken a crisis for the system to see what should have been obvious from her resume. You deserve this. You always deserved it, he said. The fact that you had to risk your job to prove it says more about our failures than your qualifications. They walked toward the cardiology wing together. Their dynamic shifted from hierarchical to something more like colleagues, and Ethan realized he was genuinely looking forward to learning from her rather than just working alongside her. Dr. Green's right that I need to learn diagnostic humility. Any suggestions on where to start? He asked, the question genuine rather than rhetorical. Lucia smiled slightly, the first unguarded expression he'd seen from her. Start by listening when people speak, especially people you assume know less than you, because they might know different things, and different is often more valuable than more, she said. The wisdom in that simple advice felt hard-earned through years of being the person others assumed knew less. And Ethan committed to making it more than just another platitude. That evening, Lucia called her mother in Manila with news that felt miraculous after 3 years of quietly enduring professional exile. Mama, they're letting me be a doctor again, she said in Tagalog, her voice breaking with emotion she'd held back during the official meeting. Not full-time yet, but fellowship. I can practice. I can use my training. I can tell people I'm a cardiologist without feeling like I'm lying about my current life. Her mother's tears carried across the phone line, joy mixing with vindication that her daughter's sacrifices might finally yield the success she deferred for family obligations. Your father would be so proud, Anik. He always said your gift for healing would find its way back to you, her mother said. They talked for an hour about next steps, licensing exams, the fellowship's details, and what this meant for the money Lucia sent home each month. Slightly less now, but her mother insisted she keep more for her own life in America after years of subsisting on almost nothing. I'm going to be okay. Mama. Better than okay, maybe, Lucia said as they prepared to hang up. The admission felt dangerous, like inviting fate to prove her wrong, but also necessary after so long in survival mode. She'd come to America with dreams that had been systematically dismantled, and now, through a crisis that could have destroyed her, those dreams were being rebuilt with institutional support rather than just personal determination. The irony wasn't lost on her. Sometimes you had to risk everything to get back what should have been yours all along. Meanwhile, Amber watched the news coverage of Lucia's fellowship announcement from her apartment, already calculating how to salvage her career from the wreckage of Ethan's show. She'd built Heart Matters into Emmy-worthy television by heightening drama, smoothing out messy reality, and creating narratives that audiences loved. And now everyone acted like she committed some terrible crime by giving them exactly what they wanted. Medical ethics over ratings. One network executive had said primly, as if their entire industry wasn't built on monetizing tragedy and conflict. Amber poured another glass of wine and scrolled through her phone, seeing text messages from Ethan that she'd ignored for days, apologies mixed with questions about whether they could salvage their relationship now that the professional partnership had exploded. The truth was she didn't love Ethan, had never loved him, had seen him as a vehicle for her own ambitions more than a person with whom to build a life. But she also didn't regret their relationship or even the show's approach. She'd made compelling television that educated millions while entertaining them, and if some medical purists clutched their pearls about accuracy, well, that was the price of mass-market success. What bothered her more was being blamed for Ethan's mistakes when all she'd done was film what he was already doing, performing medicine like theater, prioritizing audience over accuracy, wanting adoration more than truth. If he'd really cared about patient care over cameras, he would have stopped filming years ago rather than blaming her for his own choices now that consequences had arrived. The next day, Amber received an unexpected call from a network executive interested in her perspective on what had happened with Heart Matters. She assumed it was a termination call, but the tone suggested something different: interest rather than judgment, curiosity rather than condemnation. "We're developing a reality show about medical mistakes and accountability. What happens when doctors get it wrong and patients suffer?" the executive explained. "Your footage of the senator case is exactly the kind of authentic drama we want, and we think you'd be perfect to produce it given your experience." The offer should have felt like vindication, but instead Amber felt a queasy recognition of who she'd become. Someone willing to turn other people's crises into entertainment. Someone who valued narrative over truth. Someone who'd shaped Ethan's worst instincts rather than challenging them. "I need to think about it," she told the executive, surprising herself with the hesitation. "Can I get back to you?" After hanging up, Amber sat in her expensive apartment filled with awards for shows that had exploited human suffering prettily, and for the first time in her career, she wondered whether fame and success were worth the cost of becoming someone she didn't particularly like. The realization felt uncomfortable, like seeing yourself clearly for the first time and not enjoying the view, but it was also oddly freeing. If she didn't like who she was, maybe she could choose to become someone different. The question was whether she wanted that badly enough to walk away from offers that validated exactly who she'd been. 3 weeks into Lucia's clinical fellowship, the cardiology department buzzed with unusual energy as she presented her first case at Grand Rounds, a teaching conference where doctors discussed challenging diagnoses. She stood at the podium in a white coat that finally felt legitimate rather than borrowed, presenting a patient with suspected myocarditis who'd actually had eosinophilic myocarditis secondary to undiagnosed strongyloidiasis, another tropical disease mimicking cardiac conditions. The audience of residents and attending physicians listened with genuine interest rather than condescension, and Lucia felt the profound satisfaction of teaching medicine on her own terms rather than watching from the margins. The key differential point is the travel history and the specific pattern of eosinophils on biopsy, she explained, displaying microscope slides that showed the distinctive parasitic forms. In the Philippines and other endemic regions, we test for this routinely, but American medicine often misses it because the working diagnosis assumes domestic exposure only. Several residents took notes. One raised a hand with a thoughtful question about diagnostic algorithms, and Lucia answered with the confidence of someone who'd treated hundreds of these cases in field conditions where missing the diagnosis meant death. After presentation, the chief of cardiology approached her with what looked like genuine respect. "That was excellent, Dr. Reyes. We need more global health perspective in our training," he said, and Lucia felt tears prick behind her professional composure because he called her doctor naturally rather than as courtesy, recognizing her expertise rather than just her fellowship position. Ethan attended the Grand Rounds in the back row. Watching Lucia command the room with authority, he was only beginning to understand she'd always possessed. The contrast of their first interaction struck him painfully. He'd seen scrubs and an accent and made assumptions about knowledge, while she'd been operating from a depth of experience that exceeded his own in specific domains, even if her credentials didn't fit American templates. "She's brilliant," whispered Dr. Singh, the infectious disease specialist sitting beside Ethan. "I've already consulted her on 2 cases this week. Her pattern recognition for tropical presentations is better than anyone in the region, maybe the country." Ethan nodded, pride mixing with something more complicated that he didn't want to examine too closely. Admiration, certainly, but also a growing awareness that his feelings toward Lucia had shifted from professional respect into personal interest that might not be appropriate given their recent history. She'd saved his career as much as Crawford's life, taught him to see medicine differently, and challenged his assumptions about hierarchy and worth, and somewhere in that process, He'd started noticing the way her eyes lit up when she talked about diagnoses, the grace with which she navigated a system still designed to underestimate her, the strength required to maintain dignity, while fighting for recognition others received automatically. As the conference ended and colleagues surrounded Lucia with questions, Ethan realized he wanted to know her beyond their professional collaboration, not as a nurse he dismissed or even the doctor he learned from, but as a person whose company he craved beyond the hospital's walls. The Diagnostic Humility program launched with surprising success, drawing residents from across the hospital who were hungry for training that acknowledged medicine's human dimensions beyond technical skill. Ethan and Lucia co-taught sessions about cognitive bias, hierarchical communication failures, and the expertise hidden in non-physician staff that doctors often dismissed. Anyone in this hospital, from janitors to techs to nurses, might see something you miss because they're looking from a different angle, Lucia told a group of surgical residents. The question isn't whether they have an MD after their name, it's whether their observation is accurate and relevant to patient care. Ethan supported her teaching with his own stories of failure, turning his senator crisis into a cautionary tale rather than hiding it. I almost killed a man because I assumed my expertise was the only expertise that mattered, he told the residents. I heard concerns from someone more qualified than me in a specific domain, and I dismissed her because she didn't fit my narrow definition of credible, and that arrogance nearly destroyed both our careers and Senator Crawford's life. The vulnerability in his admission made the teaching more powerful than any academic lecture could achieve, and residents started sharing their own experiences of dismissing valuable input because it came from unexpected sources. The program became more than just ethics training. It evolved into genuine culture change, challenging the hierarchies that had governed medicine for centuries and often prevented the best care from emerging. Lucia found herself becoming something of a minor celebrity within the hospital. Not the social media fame she'd briefly experienced, but institutional recognition that felt more substantial and lasting. Doctors consulted her on complex cases, administrators asked her input on foreign medical graduate policies, and medical students requested her as a mentor specifically because her story resonated with their own fears about success being contingent on credentials rather than competence. She still worked long hours and sent money home to Manila, but now her work felt meaningful rather than merely necessary. She was practicing medicine at the level her training demanded, teaching the next generation, and actively changing the system that had tried to erase her expertise. "It's everything I wanted when I came to America," she told Maria over coffee in the cafeteria one morning. Not the fame part, but the respect part. Being seen for what I can actually do rather than just where I happen to train or what accent I speak with. Maria squeezed her hand. Their earlier tension about hidden credentials resolved by Lucia's success making space for others. "You earned this," Maria said, not through luck or connections, but by being so good they couldn't ignore you even when they wanted to. The affirmation from a colleague who understood the invisible obstacles immigrant professionals faced felt more validating than any administrative pronouncement or media coverage possibly could. 6 weeks into their professional collaboration, Ethan finally worked up the courage to ask Lucia to dinner outside the hospital. Not a work meeting, but an actual social invitation that might reveal whether his growing attraction was mutual or one-sided. "There's a Filipino restaurant in Fells Point I've been meaning to try," he said awkwardly, trying to make the invitation casual while his heart pounded. "And I thought, since you're the expert on Filipino food, maybe you want to go sometime? Like, not as doctors, but as people who enjoy food." The invitation came out more stilted than he'd intended, and he saw Lucia's expression shift to something guarded. "Ethan, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure that's appropriate given our working relationship and our history," she said gently. "You're my supervisor in the fellowship, and we've just started rebuilding professional respect after you dismissed me publicly. Adding romantic complications seems like asking for trouble." The rejection stung but also felt fair, and Ethan recognized the wisdom in her caution, even as he wished she'd said yes. "You're right. I wasn't thinking clearly about the power dynamics or how it might look," he admitted. I respect you, Lucia, not just professionally but as a person, and I wanted to know you better outside the hospital context. But you're absolutely correct that I should have thought through the implications before asking." Lucia's expression softened at his acceptance of her boundary rather than pushing. Maybe someday if circumstances change and power dynamics equalize, she said. But right now I need to focus on my fellowship and licensing exams and proving I deserve this position based on competence rather than any personal connection to you. The qualified hope in her words, maybe someday, kept his spirits up even as he respected her immediate refusal. That night, Lucia lay awake in her apartment thinking about Ethan's invitation and her own conflicting feelings that had made her say no despite genuine attraction. The truth was she'd also developed feelings beyond professional respect. He'd proven himself capable of genuine change, had supported her fellowship publicly when he could have protected his own reputation instead, and showed vulnerability that made him human rather than just the arrogant doctor she'd first encountered. But she'd also learned through hard experience that romantic relationships with powerful men rarely worked out for women still fighting for professional credibility, especially immigrant women whose success might be attributed to beauty or connections rather than competence. "I can't afford to be the fellowship doctor who's sleeping with her supervisor," she said aloud to her empty bedroom. "I worked too hard to get here to risk people saying I didn't earn it." The same instinct that had made her challenge Ethan about Senator Crawford, protecting what mattered most even at personal cost, now demanded she protect her professional reputation, even if it meant denying her personal feelings. But that didn't stop her from imagining what might be possible once she passed her licensing exams, once a fellowship ended, once their professional relationship no longer created ethical complications, a future where attraction didn't threaten credibility, where love didn't undermine everything she'd sacrificed to build in America. "Maybe someday," she repeated into the darkness, letting herself want something beyond just professional success for the first time in 3 years. Meanwhile, Amber had made her decision about the network's offer, and it wasn't the choice she'd expected to make even a month earlier. "I'm turning down the medical mistakes show," she told the executive over a phone call she rehearsed a dozen times. "I've realized I don't want to build a career on exploiting people's suffering, even if it makes compelling television and wins awards." The admission felt like career suicide, walking away from exactly the kind of project producers dream about, but it also felt necessary for reasons she was still processing. "I'm going to pivot into medical education documentaries. Fact-checked, thoroughly researched, actually useful content rather than dramatic narratives that sacrifice accuracy for emotion," she continued. "It'll be less sexy and probably less profitable, but maybe I can use my skills to inform rather than just entertain." The executive sounded disappointed, but not entirely surprised, and Amber wondered if her moral crisis was more common in the industry than anyone admitted publicly. After hanging up, she drafted an email to Ethan that she'd been avoiding for weeks. Not an apology exactly, because she still didn't think she'd done anything he hadn't also chosen, but an acknowledgement that they both lost themselves in fame, and maybe it was time to find their way back separately. "You deserve better than someone who cared more about ratings than your actual well-being, and I deserve better than a relationship based on mutual careerism rather than genuine connection," she wrote. "I hope you find real happiness with someone who sees you as a person rather than a project." Sending it felt like closing a chapter on who she'd been while opening space for whoever she might become next. 2 months into Lucia's fellowship, just as she was beginning to feel secure in her position, the attack came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. A medical blog published an article titled "Diversity Hire or Deserved Promotion." Questions surround Filipino nurses' rapid rise at Hopkins, questioning whether Lucia's fellowship was based on merit or politically correct tokenism following the senator incident. The article cited anonymous sources claiming her medical credentials from the Philippines couldn't be verified, suggesting her work might have been exaggerated, and implying the hospital was more interested in good publicity than actual qualifications. The comments section exploded with armchair diagnosticians debating whether she truly saved Senator Crawford or just gotten lucky, whether foreign medical training could possibly match American standards, and whether the whole incident had been staged for media attention. Lucia read the article during her lunch break and felt the familiar sensation of the ground crumbling beneath her feet, just when she'd started believing she belonged. Someone was publicly questioning whether she deserved to be here at all. The article gained traction on social media, shared by people who loved to question diversity initiatives and those who genuinely wondered about credential verification in medicine. How do we know she was really a top cardiologist in Manila? Anyone can claim credentials from overseas, one viral tweet asked. Lucia's inbox filled with hate mail. some overtly racist, others wrapped in concerned trolling about patient safety and American medical standards. The hospital's communications office went into damage control mode, but their carefully worded statement about proper credential verification somehow made things worse by implying there had been doubt. Ethan watched the social media pile on with growing fury, recognizing the same dynamics that had dismissed Lucia's initial warnings about Senator Crawford. She was being questioned not because of actual evidence, but because people couldn't accept that expertise might come in packages they didn't expect. "We need to push back on this," he told Dr. Green in an emergency meeting. "Lucia's credentials are impeccable, her fellowship is earned, and letting this narrative stand unchallenged will destroy her professionally and personally." Dr. Green agreed, but noted that official statements often fuel conspiracy theories rather than quelling them. They needed something more powerful than hospital PR to combat the smear campaign. Senator Crawford's office released a statement defending Lucia, but critics dismissed it as political favor trading rather than objective assessment. "Of course we'll defend her. She saved him. But that doesn't mean she's qualified for fellowship," one pundit said on cable news. The insinuation that Lucia's competence in one case didn't prove general excellence infuriated Ethan even as he recognized its superficial logic to people who didn't know her full story. What nobody mentioning was that Lucia's licensing exam results had just come back showing scores in the 95th percentile across all categories, that her fellowship evaluations were stellar, that she'd already been invited to present at 2 national cardiology conferences. The story wasn't about her actual qualifications, but about the satisfying narrative of the immigrant nurse who'd gotten too big for her boots being taken down a peg. And that narrative appealed to people's worst instincts regardless of facts. Lucia herself stayed quiet, following the hospital's advice not to engage with anonymous critics, but Ethan could see the toll it was taking. She was withdrawn, hyper-professional, defensive in ways she hadn't been before the attack started. "I keep thinking I should just go back to being a nurse," she admitted to him one evening after a particularly brutal day of online harassment. "At least then people don't question whether I deserve my position. They just ignore me instead." The defeat in her voice broke something in Ethan's chest, making him realize he'd do anything to restore the confidence she'd earned through years of competence in the face of systematic dismissal. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Lucia's former mentor from Philippine General Hospital, Dr. Carlos Santos, who'd retired but still maintained connections throughout international cardiology circles. He released an open letter to the American medical community detailing Lucia's training, listing the papers she'd published, describing the clinic she'd built from nothing in Mindanao, and vouching for her clinical skills with a kind of institutional weight that transcended national borders. "Dr. Lucia Reyes was the most gifted diagnostic cardiologist I trained in 35 years of medical education," he wrote. Her decision to start over in America as a nurse rather than abandon medicine entirely showed the kind of dedication to patients that should be celebrated, not questioned. He attached verification documents, fellowship certificates, publication records, and testimonials from colleagues who'd worked with her, a comprehensive dossier that demolished the unverified credentials narrative in one devastating document dump. The letter went viral for different reasons in a hit piece, shared by medical professionals who recognize the phenomenon of foreign-trained doctors being systematically undervalued in American healthcare. "This happens to thousands of immigrant physicians every year," one prominent medical blogger wrote. "We're wasting global expertise because of credential gatekeeping, and Dr. Reyes's case proves how much we lose." The narrative began to shift from "did she really deserve it?" to "why did it take a crisis for us to recognize what was obvious from her resume?" Additional support came from an unexpected coalition. Maria and other Filipino nurses at Hopkins organized a press conference highlighting the common experience of skilled immigrant medical professionals working below their training level. They brought former doctors now working as nurses, surgeons now working as physician assistants, specialists now working as medical techs, all with verified credentials and years of experience, but trapped in credential limbo by the American medical system. Dr. Reyes is an exception or a diversity hire. She's one of thousands of us who came to America with expertise that gets systematically ignored, Maria said, her voice steady despite visible nervousness. The only difference is she got lucky enough to be in the right place to prove herself publicly, but every person standing here could tell similar stories of being dismissed despite their qualifications. The press conference shifted the conversation from Lucia's individual merit to systematic issues affecting entire communities, making it harder to dismiss her as a one-off case or affirmative action gone wrong. News coverage evolved from questioning her credentials to investigating why America was failing to utilize skilled immigrants already living and working in the country, a much larger story that made Lucia's personal triumph part of a broader narrative about wasted talent and bureaucratic barriers. Ethan watched the public vindication with satisfaction, but also growing clarity about his own feelings. He didn't just respect Lucia professionally or admire her resilience generally. He was falling in love with her specifically in ways that went beyond crisis response and professional collaboration. The revelation terrified him because it meant genuine vulnerability rather than just career rebuilding or guilt-driven support, and he had no idea whether she felt anything similar or still saw him primarily as the arrogant doctor who'd once humiliated her publicly. He found himself noticing small things. The way she bit her lip while reading complex echocardiograms, her habit of humming Filipino songs while reviewing patient charts, the fierce concentration when she taught residents that reminded him why he'd loved medicine before celebrity corrupted it. "I think I'm in love with her," he admitted to Dr. Singh during a rare moment of honesty between colleagues. "Not because she saved my career or because I feel guilty, but because she's brilliant and kind and stronger than anyone I've ever met. And I have no idea what to do about it given our professional relationship and the fact that she rejected my dinner invitation 2 months ago." Dr. Singh laughed, not unkindly. "Maybe start by making sure you're pursuing her for the right reasons and not because she represents a redemption arc you want for yourself," he suggested. "And then, if you're sure it's genuine, be patient. Women who've been systematically underestimated learn to be cautious about men who suddenly see their worth, especially when those men previously contributed to their dismissal." The advice felt both obvious and profound, reminding Ethan that his timeline didn't dictate Lucia's readiness, and that real love required respecting her needs rather than pushing his own. That weekend, Lucia finally allowed herself to celebrate the vindication by taking a day off and visiting the Filipino market in Baltimore, where she could speak Tagalog freely and buy ingredients that tasted like home. The support from her community, both in the hospital and in the broader Filipino diaspora, had reminded her that she wasn't alone in this fight, that her struggle represented thousands of others whose stories might never get media coverage but deserved recognition nonetheless. She bought pork and vegetables to make adobo, the comfort food of her childhood, and called her mother to describe the press conference and Dr. Santos' letter. "Your father would say you're bringing honor to all of us," her mother said, voice thick with emotion. "Not just our family, but everyone who came to America with skills and dreams and had to start over." The weight of that representation felt heavy but also motivating. If her success could open doors for others, then enduring the attacks and criticism was worth it beyond just personal vindication. As she cooked that evening, filling her apartment with the smell of garlic and vinegar, Lucia felt something she hadn't allowed herself in years. Hope not just for survival, but for genuine flourishing, for a life in America that honored both who she'd been in Manila and who she was becoming in Baltimore. The email from Ethan arrived as she was plating dinner, a simple message saying, "I saw the press conference and I'm proud of you, not as your fellowship supervisor, but as someone who's grateful to know you," and Lucia read it 3 times, trying to decide whether his words were purely professional or hinted at something more personal that she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge yet. The hospital's annual gala was Baltimore's premier medical fundraiser, where philanthropists mix with physicians in a black-tie celebration of healthcare innovation and charitable giving. Lucia had received an invitation as a fellowship doctor, but almost declined, uncomfortable with the ostentatious display of wealth, and worried about navigating social hierarchies without the buffer of white coats and clinical roles. "You have to go. You're one of our rising stars now, and donors want to meet you," Dr. Green had insisted. So Lucia found herself in a department store trying on formal dresses with Maria, feeling like an imposter playing dress-up even though she knew her fellowship had been legitimately earned. "Get something that makes you feel powerful," Maria advised. "These galas are all about perception, and you've earned the right to take up space confidently instead of apologetically." Lucia chose a midnight blue gown that was elegant without being overly provocative, professional yet beautiful, the kind of dress that said she belonged at the gala as a doctor rather than a help. Looking at her reflection in the dressing room mirror, hairstyled, makeup carefully applied, dress fitting perfectly. Lucia barely recognized herself as the exhausted nurse in wrinkled scrubs who blocked an operating room door 4 months ago, and she wondered which version was more authentically her or whether both could somehow coexist in her complicated American identity. Ethan saw Lucia arrive at the gala and felt his breath catch in a way that went beyond mere attraction into something that felt dangerously like reverence. She looked stunning in the blue gown, moving to the crowd with a grace that suggested confidence rather than the anxiety he knew she probably felt. He brought no date to the gala despite several suggestions from well-meaning colleagues. Unable to imagine spending the evening making small talk with someone who wasn't Lucia, even though bringing her as his date would have been inappropriate given their professional relationship. Instead, he watched from across the ballroom as donors approached her, clearly intrigued by the story they'd read in the papers, and he felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness mixed with pride. She handled their questions with perfect diplomacy, neither downplaying her achievements nor exaggerating them for effect, simply being herself with the kind of authentic presence that couldn't be faked or taught. "You're staring," Dr. Singh said beside him, amused. Very subtle, very professional. Ethan didn't bother denying it. "I'm trying to figure out when it became impossible to imagine my life without her in it," he admitted. "Not as a colleague or a redemption project, but as someone I want to know every morning when I wake up and every evening before I sleep. Is that insane given our history?" Dr. Singh considered carefully before answering. "It's insane if you're romanticizing her because she represents your better nature, but it's perfectly rational if you genuinely love who she is beyond what she's taught you about yourself," he said. "The question is which one you're actually feeling, and only you can answer that honestly." Amber arrived at the gala unexpectedly, her presence causing a ripple of surprise whispers since everyone knew she and Ethan had broken up and her show had been canceled. She'd been invited in her new capacity as a documentary producer, working on a project about foreign medical graduates that had grown out of her crisis of conscience after the senator incident. Spotting Lucia across the room, Amber made the deliberate choice to approach rather than avoid, knowing she owed something even if she couldn't quite name what that something was. "Dr. Reyes," she said formally, and Lucia turned with visible wariness. "I wanted to apologize for my role in what happened with Senator Crawford. I encouraged Ethan to prioritize drama over caution, and I filmed your confrontation without considering how it might affect your life beyond just making good television." The apology came out more stilted than Amber had intended. Years of media training, making genuine emotion difficult to express. "I've been working on a documentary about immigrant physicians in America, and I've learned how many people share your story of being systematically devalued despite their expertise. If you're willing, I'd like to interview you, not for ratings, but to actually document what needs to change." Lucia studied her carefully, weighing skepticism against the possibility that Amber's contrition might be genuine. "Why the sudden conscience?" she asked bluntly. "You built a career on exactly the kind of medical theater that almost got someone killed, and now you're interested in serious journalism?" The question cut through Amber's rehearsed apology to the uncomfortable truth beneath it. Amber took a breath, deciding that honest vulnerability might work better than polished PR speak. "Because I realized I'd become someone I didn't like," she admitted. "Someone who valued success over ethics, ratings over truth, my own ambitions over other people's dignity. And watching what happened to you and Ethan made me recognize that I was complicit in creating a system where medicine became performance rather than care." The confession felt both liberating and terrifying, exposing her own failures in front of someone she'd helped harm. "I know an apology doesn't fix anything, and I understand if you never trust me, but I'm trying to do better. Not for redemption or to rebuild my career, but because I don't want to keep being the person who treats human suffering as content rather than tragedy deserving respect." Lucia saw something genuine beneath Amber's polished exterior, recognizing the courage required to admit fault publicly when doubling down will be easier. "I'll consider the interview," she said carefully. "Not because I've forgiven you completely, but because if your documentary can help other immigrant doctors avoid what I went through, then maybe something good comes from this mess." The qualified acceptance felt like grace neither of them deserved but both needed, and Amber felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since she'd first seen footage of herself encouraging Ethan to dismiss the nurse's legitimate medical concerns for the sake of dramatic television. They talked for a few minutes more, awkward but sincere, before Amber moved on, leaving Lucia to process the unexpected apology and consider whether people could actually change or just learn to perform change more convincingly. The evening's program included speeches from hospital administrators and honored donors, but the surprise came when Senator Crawford took the stage for what was billed as brief remarks. "I want to talk about a night 4 months ago when I was hours from unnecessary surgery that might have killed me," he began, and the room went silent. A nurse, now Dr. Lucia Reyes, blocked the operating room door and insisted on one more test despite being dismissed by every expert in the room, including me. He recounted the story with political flair, turning medical drama into a parable about listening to marginalized voices and recognizing expertise regardless of credentials. "Dr. Reyes didn't save my life because of her degrees or her prestigious training. She saved me because she saw what others missed, had the courage to speak up despite knowing it could cost her everything, and prioritized patient care over professional hierarchy." The audience applauded, and Crawford gestured for Lucia to stand, spotlighting her in the ballroom as cameras flashed. "Because of her, I'm launching the Foreign Medical Graduate Excellence Program with an initial endowment of $5 million to help skilled immigrant physicians like Dr. Reyes get the recognition and support they deserve," Crawford announced. "We're wasting global talent because of bureaucratic barriers. And if this program can help even a fraction of the thousands of immigrant doctors working below their training level, then we'll have honored Dr. Reyes' courage by extending its impact beyond one life to transform an entire system." The applause swelled as Lucia stood in her blue gown, tears threatening her carefully applied makeup, feeling the weight of representation and gratitude and hope that her struggle might actually create pathway for others. From across the room, Ethan watched her receive the recognition she'd always deserved, and he knew with absolute certainty that he loved her beyond any professional respect or guilt-driven support. He loved who she was, what she stood for, and the future she represented not just for medicine, but for his own capacity to be better than his worst instincts. After the speeches, Lucia found herself surrounded by well-wishers and curious donors, but she searched the crowd for Ethan with an urgency that surprised her. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and he made his way through the crowd to her side with purpose rather than hesitation. "That was incredible," he said simply. "You deserved every word of that recognition, and I'm sorry I didn't see it when we first met. Not sorry in the abstract way I've apologized before, but specifically sorry that my arrogance made you work twice as hard to prove what should have been obvious from your first day." Lucia felt something shift in her chest, her careful defenses against him crumbling under the sincerity of his repeated apologies and the consistent support he'd shown over months rather than just days. "I need some air," she said impulsively. "Will you walk with me?" They slipped away from the gala's noise to the hospital's rooftop garden, Baltimore's skyline glittering around them in the autumn night. "I was wrong earlier when I said we shouldn't complicate our working relationship," Lucia began, her heart racing. "Not wrong about the concerns being legitimate, but wrong about whether those concerns mattered more than what I actually want, which is to know you beyond the hospital, beyond our professional collaboration, beyond the crisis that brought us together." Ethan hardly dared breathe, afraid that moving might break whatever spell had brought them to this moment. "What do you want, Lucia?" he asked softly. "I want to see if the person I've been falling for over these months is real or just my imagination filling in gaps between professional interactions," she admitted. "I want to take the risk that maybe loving someone who once hurt me isn't weakness, but rather recognition that people can genuinely change. And I want to stop being so afraid of trusting my own judgment that I deny myself happiness because the timing isn't perfect or the power dynamics aren't ideal." Ethan reached for her hand carefully, giving her space to pull away if she wanted, but she laced her fingers through his instead. "I'm falling in love with you," he said, the words simple and terrifying and honest. "Not because you saved my career or taught me humility or represent some redemption I'm seeking, but because you're brilliant and brave and kind, and I can't imagine my life without you challenging me to be better, while also accepting who I actually am beneath the arrogance and insecurity." He paused, then continued with complete vulnerability. "But I also know I hurt you, and I know professional dynamics complicate everything, and I know you have every reason not to trust that I won't revert to the dismissive doctor who humiliated you when the cameras were on. So I'm not asking for immediate anything, just permission to show you over time that what I feel is real and consistent and worthy of your trust." Lucille looked at him in the darkness lit by city lights and hospital windows, seeing not the celebrity surgeon who dismissed her or even the chastened doctor who'd apologized, but simply Ethan, flawed and sincere, and offering himself without performance. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered, "even though it terrifies me and complicates everything and probably isn't the smart choice given everything we've been through." She leaned closer, and he met her halfway in a kiss that felt like mutual surrender. Not to passion, though, that was present, but to the possibility that love might be worth the risk of vulnerability despite everything that could go wrong. The kiss deepened as months of tension and denied attraction finally found expression, and when they finally pulled apart, both were breathless and smiling with the slightly stunned expression of people who just crossed a threshold they couldn't uncross. "We should probably figure out the professional implications before we tell anyone," Lucia said practically, even as she stayed in his arms. "Dr. Green will have thought about fellows dating their supervisors, and I don't want anyone suggesting I'm sleeping my way through my licensing exams." Ethan nodded, appreciating her caution, even as he wished they could simply be happy, without worrying about optics. "We'll do this right. Transparent communication with administrators, careful boundaries at work, nothing that compromises your fellowship or my role supervising it," he promised. "And if necessary, we'll request different supervisors, so there's no conflict of interest, because what matters most is protecting your career and your reputation, not hiding a relationship for convenience." His willingness to prioritize her professional standing over relationship secrecy touched Lucia deeply, suggesting he genuinely learned the lessons their crisis had taught. They stayed on a rooftop for another hour, talking about logistics and fears and hopes, making plans that balanced practical concerns with romantic optimism, and slowly building the foundation of something that might last beyond the dramatic circumstances that had brought them together. When they finally returned to gala, they arrived separately but couldn't quite hide the matching smiles or the way their eyes found each other across the room, and Dr. Singh noticed immediately, raising his champagne glass in knowing salute from across the ballroom. The hospital administration handled Lucia and Ethan's relationship with pragmatic discretion, reassigning fellowship supervision to avoid conflicts while allowing their collaboration to continue. Colleagues responded positively, relieved rather than surprised, and the acceptance helped Lucia relax into the relationship without fearing damage to her professional standing. Soon after, Lucia received her licensing exam results and discovered she had passed with distinction, attracting interest from multiple hospitals. The achievement felt complete, proof of her clinical skill, academic excellence, and professional legitimacy. When she shared the news with her mother, Lucia finally cried, recognizing that her success was a result of collective sacrifice, not individual effort. She vowed to use her position to create opportunities for other immigrant physicians still facing the barriers she had overcome. Ethan took Lucia to the Filipino restaurant they had long discussed, where they spoke honestly about their futures. With job offers from several institutions on the table, Lucia asked where he saw himself. Ethan answered simply that he saw his future wherever she was, valuing partnership over geography or personal ambition. His willingness to adapt dissolved Lucia's remaining doubts, grounding their relationship in mutual respect rather than compromise. 6 months later, Lucia accepted an attending position at Johns Hopkins, specializing in infectious and tropical cardiology. Wearing a white coat embroidered with her name felt surreal, like reclaiming a version of herself once lost. Ethan's show returned with a new format focused on global medicine, featuring Lucia as co-host and emphasizing substance over spectacle. Their professional collaboration deepened alongside their personal bond, built on shared values rather than competition. They married 8 months later in a small Baltimore church within the Filipino community, surrounded by family, colleagues, and unexpected allies like Senator Crawford. The ceremony emphasized partnership, growth, and resilience over romance. The reception blended Filipino and American traditions, celebrating not just love, but the long journey that had led them there. Lucia reflected on how far she'd come, from an unseen nurse to a recognized physician, and felt profound gratitude. A year later, Lucia and Ethan opened a free cardiology clinic in Manila named after her father, honoring the sacrifices that made her journey possible. Watching Ethan work respectfully alongside Filipino doctors, Lucia felt the circle complete, her success now generating opportunity for others. That evening, she shared joyful news. She was pregnant. Surrounded by family and colleagues who remembered her early brilliance, Lucia felt whole, having built a life that honored all parts of her identity. 6 months later, back in Baltimore, Lucia accepted the AMA Humanitarian Award alongside Ethan for their work reforming foreign medical graduate policies. The recognition mattered less than the impact. New pathways for immigrant doctors, institutional reforms, and lasting change. In her speech, Lucia emphasized that individual success only matters when it creates opportunity for others. As she stood with Ethan, their unborn child moving between them, Lucia felt the story complete. Humility learned, dignity reclaimed, and love that transformed them both into something better together than either could have been alone.